Yeah, so I want to start by just a sort of quick note about transcription and make some sort of obvious statements. So transcription is, without doubt, the primary representation. We linguists, we media technologists, everybody use to represent speech in a non-oral, non-audio format. Transcripts are also almost always text. When we think about transcription, we think about them as text. And of course, they're extremely valuable as a way to transmit and share information about speech recordings and media broadcasts and so forth. So transcripts are absolutely valuable. At the same time, it's been sort of well noted for many years that there are some sort of inherent problems with transcripts, or at least with any individual transcript and the particular decisions that we make when building transcripts. So the title of this slide, Transcription as Theory, comes from Eleanor Oakes' 1979 chapter, and that's why I bolded that reference here. So she and numerous others have pointed out that things like how we lay out text in transcription, to the decisions we make in encoding nonverbal things, pauses and overlaps and things like that, really impact what we can do with a transcript sort of further on and down the line. And so to sort of sum up a sort of introduction to transcription is that it's not theory neutral, right? Anything we do in transcription is an act of analysis, is sort of dependent on our theories about language or speech or the data that we're working with. So what I want to think about today is sort of thinking about transcription as something that's not just text and sort of moves beyond text. And so I have a few questions here. How can we use visualization methods to re-examine, to reimagine transcription, to sort of question our own transcriptions? What kinds of insights can we gain into discourse from new visual approaches? And I think Dan gave some really nice examples of just that in the last talk. And I should say I'm mostly a sort of quantitative, I'm a person who studies language variation and change quantitatively, so I'm also interested in can we use visualization methods, visual approaches to discourse to think of new sort of quantitative ways to get at language variation and change. So to think about these things, I'm going to be drawing on work I've been doing for quite some time on speech data management software, speech data management tools. And so I'm going to be talking almost entirely about things in this project called the Sociolinguistic Archive and Analysis Project, or SLAAP. And I'm going to draw very briefly from a related project I've also been involved in called the Online Speech Corpora Archive and Analysis Resource, or OSCAR. And so maybe as a quick apology, I know some people here have seen me talk about these things before, and you've probably heard me sort of say many of the things that I'm going to say today. But this conference and sort of thinking about visualization has been a great opportunity for me to come back to some of the things that actually brought me to speech data management in the first place. And it was really sort of thinking about transcription and transcription as theory that made me interested in sort of building online tools to interact with speech data and so forth. So it's sort of a coming full circle kind of thing. Okay, so SLAAP is a fairly large web-based database of sociolinguistic recordings. I'm not going to say very much about it. I just don't have time today. We have something like 2,300, 2,400 hours of sociolinguistic interviews that are stored in SLAAP. About 100 hours of those are transcribed. That's about 1 million words of transcription. And obviously I'm talking about the transcript parts today. There are a lot of other features of SLAAP I'm not going to talk about. This screenshot is just showing a list of interviews, so each row is a separate interview, and then we have different features and ways that we can access those. So SLAAP gives us access to, or sort of an interface to transcripts as we see here, so a very basic view. Our work in SLAAP and transcriptions in SLAAP are highly oriented around sort of temporal things. So we've got accurate timestamps for each utterance, and then pauses are blank lines. So we've got a sort of basic transcript here, and this is just a screenshot to give you a flavor of that. Now there are other ways, sorry, before I do that. So we can also do other things. We can say show the audio player, listen to the audio, and bounce around the transcript while listening to the audio, and so forth. So we can interface with the audio recordings. Again, SLAAP is mostly a sort of database system to manage speech recordings. Okay, we can also view transcripts in different text-based formats, and I'm not showing those today just because I want to have time to focus on some other things. So I could have, and perhaps I would have spent less time talking about it had I just shown you some other screenshots of text versions of transcripts. Okay, but just one other sort of aside before we get into the two main sort of visual features I want to focus on. We can also do other things, so we can zoom into particular lines. So here I've selected one line in this transcript, and then we can do other things like extract just the audio for that line, generate a spectrogram, or here pull out an intensity track, which hopefully you can see in the rightmost slide better than the left slide. Okay, so we can sort of interface with the audio from the transcript. Okay, so before I get to the visualization techniques I want to focus on, just a sort of brief look at how this whole speech data management system works. So we store media files in file space on this web server. So those are the sort of basic or core data. And then we have a whole range of different kinds of metadata that are housed in relational databases, and it's just using MySQL for this. So these are things like transcripts, but also notes that we can timestamp and associate to the audio, variable tabulations, and you'll see that a little bit, so sort of sociolinguistic variables that have been coded, and so forth. All these things live in a relational database, and sort of overall, while I didn't design the system sort of specifically following the annotation graph framework, the idea is similar, right? We're using a timeline. If you're familiar with this idea, you'll know what I mean. But basically, we're using a timeline as a way to anchor all different kinds of annotations in a sort of common framework. So transcript lines themselves are just, transcripts are individual database tables, and then transcript lines are just sort of basic things that that know when they start, when they end, who the speaker is, have some kind of simple orthographic representation, just basic text, and then sort of optionally a bunch of other metadata. So we could have, say, things like part of speech tags or whatever else, though we're not going to care about that stuff today. We generate the transcripts almost entirely in Prot, and I imagine most folks here, at least people who do sort of phonetic work are familiar with Prot, but this is just illustrating a text grid. So we use Prot to generate sort of highly accurate or precisely time-aligned transcripts, though any sort of transcription tool that does time alignment will work. Those transcript files are uploaded to SLAAP, which parses them and then stores them in its database format. And then once they're there, the idea is that software can display them in all different kinds of ways because they're just database data. Now, I've already mentioned the sort of focus on temporal precision, but one sort of requirement that we've actualized in SLAAP is this requirement towards temporal accuracy. So we're pretty lax about, say, orthographic, punctuation, things like that, orthography. But we're pretty strict about this sort of criteria where we're delimiting pauses in speech, right? So utterances or individual transcript lines are phonation that's been separated from silence. And I point out here that we target something like 60 milliseconds as a sort of pause boundary. And of course, that's very, very short. And analysts or transcribers, have trouble at that sort of shortness. But that's our sort of target. Okay. All right. So back to a text transcript. And then we'll move from that to the first of the two visualization techniques I want to talk about today. This first one is something we've called a graphicalization. It's really just a tablature-like format of transcription, but we've taken out all the text. So we just have two speakers, because there are just two speakers in this interaction. And we see when each person speaks, just as the colored or gray rectangles, right? And then the darkness of shading is indicating the rate of speech. And we see sort of pauses and overlap and so forth. So we get a very quick view of sort of who's speaking when and how sort of turn-taking is operating here. And now in this first view, we've got some settings, and sort of the main setting to care about is the resolution. So this is just showing 4 pixels to represent a second of speech. Okay? And now we can change that, and we can say, well, show 40 pixels to represent a second of speech, and then sort of, mostly because that gives us enough space to put in some text, we can also see text if we want, and hopefully you can, if you can't read it, hopefully you can at least see it, so we get the orthography there too. Okay, so a sort of quick view, an ability to sort of glance at the interaction, and of course it goes way off screen to the right for a long time. Okay, so I mentioned that it's showing speech rate, and I should point out that's done sort of automatically and dynamically by a fairly simple syllable counting algorithm. So it's quite simple, but it's actually pretty effective and does a good job almost all of the time. So all of this stuff is being done dynamically and on the fly. Okay, a final view of graphicalization in SLAAP. Here now we've got 8 pixel resolution, and it's also showing a bunch of these tags, and these are variables, different variables that have been coded by analysts, so we're seeing these sort of in place as they occur in the discourse. Okay, and we could imagine these being any kinds of notes or sort of things that we're interested in, whether they're sort of noting qualitative things or quantitative things and so forth. So they're giving a sense of where features of interest occur. All right, and the final view of graphicalization here, which has actually proven to be one of the most useful uses of this, is actually not from SLAAP, but comes from a bunch of reading passage data that are stored in Oscar. And these are sort of more experimental or lab-based recordings. And again, it's reading passages, and this is just 6 individual subjects, and what we can see very quickly is how different their reading styles are. So where they're sort of chunking up the reading passage, how fast each person's reading, and so forth. So we're able to see, see that very quickly. Okay. So that's graphicalization, which gives us a sort of quick sense of what's going on in these transcripts and discourse, or as I showed in reading passages. And in some ways, it's just an example of ways that we can very quickly, dynamically create graphical versions of transcriptions, and to point out there's lots of possibilities. Now, I think I've already pointed out the rest of this about how we're generating these graphicalizations. So now I want to turn to a second kind of visualization that we've developed in SLAAP, and this is sort of a bit more grounded in a line of research and comes out of work by Frida Goldman-Eisler and others in the 1960s and sort of on, that's looked at speech timing from a psycholinguistic perspective. In particular, that's been interested in sort of pauses as indicators of processing activity and so forth. So just very briefly, this kind of approach and I'll come back to this Henderson et al. Paper, this whole approach to pauses is based on this idea that lots and lots of empirical evidence has shown that pauses correspond to things like difficulty in parsing, difficulty in language production, pauses are longer before words with less predictability, and so on, and sort of overall this summary statement. We could say that there's a lawful relationship between temporal phenomena in human speech and concurrent cognitive processes. Okay, so as a part of this line of research, Goldman-Eisler and her colleagues, here Alan Henderson was the lead author, wrote this paper in 1966 developing a sort of graphing format that we'll call a Henderson graph. And so what this does is it shows speech unfold over time in the stairwise pattern, where the horizontal axis represents actual phonation, talk, and the vertical axis represents pause. So as speech unfolds, we simply draw lines sort of horizontally during talk, vertically during pause. Okay, and we get a stairwise pattern. Now, the Henderson et al. Work was really interested in sort of what's become known as cognitive rhythm, and this idea that there are alternating sort of cycles and so forth. We don't really have to care about that at all. What we just want to care about here is that this sort of overall slope of these different segments gives us a sort of smoothed or a sense of a pause to talk ratio or a measure of hesitancy. And so Henderson et al. Talk about this as hesitant phases and fluent phases. We can just think of the slope as indicating a sort of a measure of hesitancy. All right, so we've built this tool in SLAAP, so sort of working in the same way that the graphicalization visualization works. We can just sort of pull information out of the database and dynamically generate a graph. So it's the same two speakers we've been seeing all along, Keisha and Carissa, and we see, this is Keisha's turn, and hopefully you can see these lines okay? So a short utterance, a pause, another utterance, short pause, and so forth, okay? All right, and we can see this sort of unfolding. And as before, there's a bunch of different settings, and of course, to make this meaningful, we can't view like the whole interview at one time. Here we're just seeing about 35 seconds of the interview. We can change the resolution. We can also overlay the variable codes again. So this is the same data, the same interview I showed before, and hopefully you can see there are these colored sort of vertical labels indicating where different features have been coded. And I didn't point this out before, but the colors are telling us something about the quality of those variables. So for instance, we've coded the variable ing, talking, and talk in, and the colors giving us a quick sense of whether somebody said in or ing in a particular token, and so forth, and a bunch of other variables here. Okay, so we can dynamically generate these graphs, and we can sort of customize them in various ways. And then the software can also help us generate the slope lines. And there are several different ways to do this. And actually, sort of coming to this question brings us to a question that came up in the other talk I was in yesterday. Just when we think about sort of visualization, we think about presenting sort of complex figures, or in this case, think about generating slope lines, right? We have all these questions we have to answer about sort of, well, what's the most meaningful way to do it, and what are the things we're going to ignore, and so forth. So there's lots of different ways to generate slopes. We can just connect dots, the start and the end, or we could sort of do some smoothing or so forth here, and this is the technique that I've mostly used, that there are other options available in SLAAP. It's just a linear model that finds a best fit line for each individual segment. So we've got these orange lines that are automatically generated. And a user, I don't really have time to go into the details, but a user can override that or can break very long segments into multiple segments, and so forth. Okay, so we get these different slope lines, and if you can read it, we're getting R-square values and the slopes just displayed on the graph, just so that we can see them here. Okay. So the Henderson graph, I'll argue, lets us sort of envision and come up with a range of different kinds of quantitative predictors. The most sort of straightforward is simply what's the slope of a line for a given speaker turn, or given, not utterance, but sort of larger than an utterance segment. So we can use slope as a quantitative predictor of other kinds of things. We could also come up with other things like labeled here delta slope, the change in slope from one segment to another, and so on, right? We can envision lots of different things. So just to sort of, to think about this a bit more, I want to talk about a very brief case study, and this is, involves looking at the same interviews I've used as demonstration sort of throughout. And these are, to say a little bit about them, it's just 10 interviews with African American girls from Washington, D.C. They were the subject of a paper I wrote with Christine Mallinson and some other work that I've done, and I have to speed up here so I won't tell you more about the interviews that are really interesting. For our purposes, they're all transcribed. We've coded a bunch of variables and other things for them, and so they're about 10 2/3 hours. And so I'm skipping lots and lots of steps where we coded all these variables and et cetera, generated all these Henderson graphs, and then we can extract that from SLAAP by just, there are features that let us just download all the slope measurements and variable measures and so forth. So we can extract all that stuff, sort of collate it, and then analyze it, and I use R for that, but I'm not going over how I've done that. So the question is, do we learn anything about this particular data set through this method? And I'll give 2 quick examples of things that I think we learn. Okay, so the first comes from the slope values themselves. So if we take these 10 interviews, we've been looking at the one with Keisha, but it's just 1 of 10, and we just take the mean of the slopes across the entire interview for that one speaker, right? So there's Carissa, and then Carissa's the interviewer in each of these. And we look at these slopes, we see, right, each individual has a characteristic sort of central tendency for slope, and again, steeper slopes mean more hesitant speech. And so we could talk about, well, some of these girls are overall more hesitant than others. And actually, when looking at these particular speakers, having worked with them for quite some time, something sort of really interesting and supportive comes up. So in my work with Christine Mallinson, we've often been struck by these 2 girls, Elena and Charlisa, who sort of seem to do a lot of things in different ways than the other interviews. So they're the most talkative, they have just the longest interviews, they're sort of the most engaged in the interviews. They're the most standard in the sense that they use the least amount of vernacular African American English features. I haven't told you much about these particular girls, but they come from very sort of working class neighborhoods and backgrounds and so forth. And these girls are also the most meta-linguistically aware and so forth. And all that seems to correspond really nicely with this idea that in these interviews, by this quantitative measure, they're the least hesitant. Okay, so that's a sort of nice correspondence. Okay, the second example has to do with the sociolinguistic variable and brings us back to this ing variable. So talk in versus talking, walk in versus walking. Okay. So this variable, if you're not familiar with the literature, has been studied a lot in English. It's something we know quite a bit about ing. It's been shown to be sort of stably variable, so not changing over time, in pretty much every English-speaking community that's been studied. It shows consistent stylistic and social stratification. So when people are being more casual, they say more ins. When they're being more formal, they say more ings. Okay, and I've got a couple of figures just supporting that. So in other words, more attentive speech contains fewer in forms. Okay, and this goes all the way back to Leboeuf's work in New York City, Leboeuf 1966, and so forth. Okay, so if steeper Henderson graph slopes reflect more hesitant talk, right, we could say, well, maybe they characterize more attentive talk, and we can make a prediction that maybe steeper slopes are going to correspond with more ing than in. And so sort of skipping all the data and just going to the results here, when we run these slope measurements as one predictor as a part of a sort of larger mixed effect model of sort of what factors are influencing the rates of in and ing, we find that indeed steeper slopes are decreasing the probability of in. Right? So as these slopes increase, the speakers are less likely to produce in. Okay, so hopefully that sort of makes sense there. I'm sure I'm out of time. Okay, so I've just presented a couple of features, a very brief tour just to illustrate some of the ways that we can sort of think about the development of visual approaches to transcription, and sort of how we can maybe make them automatic or at least semi-automatic and so forth, and ways that these approaches can be used in research. And I'll admit that sort of graphicalization feature I find to be a really useful sort of exploratory view. I haven't worked with it to come up with, say, quantitative predictors and so forth, and it's a little less obvious how that could be done. But I think this Henderson graph approach is really, really promising, and if you're interested in that, it's, I talk about it quite a bit in a forthcoming monograph I have. That's this FC forthcoming B that I referenced a couple times. I'll be happy to send you that chapter. And I had meant to finish by now a public version of this Henderson graph tool where you upload a prot text grid and get back a Henderson graph. But honestly, I forgot over the last couple of months, so I haven't been working on it, and I just remembered. So I will do that. I will finish that soon, and it will be up on the SLAAP website in a sort of place where I post public tools and other kinds of things. But anyway, hopefully this just shows some of the things that we could do. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Tyler. We have a few minutes for questions. Any questions? Yes.
Yeah. So you need to encode manually the pause lengths, or if you can do it automatically?
So there are different ways to. So going, if I can get back to the prot thing. So we're using prot to do transcriptions. Yeah. So we're identifying pauses as we transcribe. I mean, there are other ways to do that. It has to be done. We've begun to use some sort of forced alignment kinds of tools to do that too, which work, though, variably depending on the quality of the data. For the most part, we don't have existing transcriptions for these 2,300 interviews. They go back to the 1960s. And so sort of we've been transcribing as we go, and we found that this is not that slow a way to transcribe compared to other ways. But we're not actually ever measuring the pauses, we're just delimiting them. And then the durations come out of the
software.
Yeah.
So can I follow up then? So with the text then, you're just using the text to present there, you're not actually using it in any other sense. So your calculations are all based on pause length and other characteristics of the signal itself. You're not.
No, so the syllable counting
so
happens.
Ins and your ins and stuff like that, I guess.
Yeah, and analysts are doing those either from the audio or from the transcript. There's a bunch of tools to facilitate both of that, but that human beings are coding variables. Though you could imagine there are lots of things we could measure directly from the transcripts or from the acoustics and not have to do that. The examples I gave are sort of traditional sociolinguistic variables that human beings have made judgments on and so forth. And then we also code them for a bunch of grammatical and phonological features, a whole range of other predictors. The orthography is used by the syllable counting algorithm, so it's syllable counting from the orthography and not the acoustics. And so there is, in that sense, the text is important, but the algorithm is fairly simple and sort of seems to work regardless of at least some decisions. Obviously spelling matters because it's mostly just counting vowels with some other tools.
You may know that the Frieda Goldman-Eisler data was collected with special analog hardware. We don't have it anymore, but we have the circuit diagrams, so we could model its behavior. The pauses and the speaking lengths were accumulated automatically after feeding the speech through this detector and timer arrangement. So there was no annotation involved at all yet.
Yeah, but so the actual tool. So Goldman Eisler was very productive and was at UCL, and wrote a lot. She had custom built hardware to do this stuff. And I know that the Henderson graph stuff they did has been quite controversial, and other people have gone back, I don't know, to their original data, but there's been an argument over whether these sort of alternations between hesitant speech and fluent speech are real, or whether any random walk will give the sense that there's those kinds of alternations. So I don't know if people have gone back to her data to sort of reanalyze that, but I know that came up in the literature, sort of people wanting to do that.
Do you know where the data is? Do you know where it's possible that we have them?
Yeah, I'd love to talk to you more about that.
Any other questions? I should also mention that Tyler is one of our conference organizers and hailing all the way from Oregon, but has been very helpful in making all of this happen. So,
Thanks.
yeah, forgive me for being remiss in mentioning that in your introduction. Thank you.
Thanks a lot.